truckload of ordinary sand, dumped as cheap road fill in rural Virginia, was quietly carrying evidence that would end up gutting one of American archaeology's most heavily defended origin stories by thousands of years. For most of the 20th century, the official rule was simple. The first humans reached the Americas roughly 13,000 years ago, carrying one specific stone spear point. That rule is wrong. For decades, the same tight circle of senior archaeologists who enforced it, a group so notorious for crushing outsiders that a rival excavator eventually branded them the Clovis Mafia, made sure almost nobody was allowed to say so out loud. Joseph McAvoy knew exactly what he was walking into when he started digging into a dune above Virginia's Nottoway River in the early 1990s. Nearly destroyed by a sand mining operation before anyone realized what was buried there, the site would consume more than a decade of his career and put him directly in the path of an establishment that did not want to be told it had gotten the beginning of American history wrong. Beneath a thin band of untouched sand on a low rise called Cactus Hill, he was about to find out exactly how far that establishment would go to protect its story. Here's how that rule got built. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters supposedly crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, followed an ice-free corridor south between two retreating glaciers, and spread across an empty continent. Their signature weapon was a fluted stone spear point, chipped with a distinctive channel down each face. First identified near Blackwater Draw, New Mexico, in the 1930s, found beside the bones of mammoths that had clearly been hunted and butchered by the people who carried it. That combination, a distinctive tool and a dead Ice Age giant in the same layer of earth, gave archaeologists a clean, dramatic, provable beginning. A whole continent's human history seemed to start at that exact moment, with that exact tool. Archaeologists called the idea Clovis-first, and for decades it wasn't treated as a theory, it was treated as a fact you didn't argue with. Museums displayed the points like crown jewels. Textbooks opened with them. For most of the last century, if you wanted to claim your site held evidence of the first Americans, you needed a fluted point and datable context, and you needed to survive the scrutiny of the small circle of senior archaeologists who guarded that origin story like a locked door. Anything older got dismissed before it was fully examined, which is what makes Cactus Hill so strange. It isn't a temple or a tomb. It's a low sand dune above the Nottoway River in Sussex County, Virginia, the kind of place you drive past without noticing, prickly pear cactus growing on its slopes. No gate, no visitor center, no plaque. For most of its history, the only people who cared about this hill were sand miners. In the late 1980s, a resident named Harold Conover noticed something odd about sand being dumped as road fill near his property, stone artifacts mixed in with it, flakes and fragments that didn't belong in ordinary construction dirt. He traced the fill back to a commercial sand mining operation, cutting into a dune above the river, trucks hauling out load after load with nobody checking what was riding along inside them. That single observation, one man noticing debris in a pile of fill dirt, is the reason Cactus Hill exists in the archaeological record at all. Retired Virginia State archaeologist Howard McCord Sr. had already logged earlier surface finds from the area. Once Conover's discovery linked those threads together, the site was formally recorded as 44SX202 and tested in 1988. What excavators eventually found was layered into that dune like pages in a book nobody had opened in 10,000 years. Near the top, familiar Clovis material, fluted points, comfortable. Below it, separated by a band of sand containing no artifacts at all, 7 to 20 centimeters of ground that had apparently sat undisturbed since long before anyone walked on it. Something else showed up, blades, not fluted points, long, narrow stone blades struck from carefully prepared cores, made from local quartzite instead of the imported chert used above. A completely different toolkit, made from completely different stone, sitting directly beneath the layer that was supposed to represent the earliest possible humans in North America. If that lower layer was what it looked like, it broke the rule the entire field had built its authority on. Cactus Hill wasn't the first site to make this kind of claim, and the sites before it were treated brutally. In the early 1970s, archaeologist James Adovasio began excavating Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, a deep sandstone overhang with radiocarbon dates from its lowest layers stretching back 16,000 years, some readings even older. The dates were consistent. The stratigraphy was carefully documented. The response wasn't curiosity. It was suspicion, then hostility. Critics argued the site's coal-bearing geology could have contaminated the samples with ancient carbon, artificially inflating the dates. Adovasio spent years defending his own excavation against accusations that amounted to incompetence, and later gave the field's gatekeepers the nickname that stuck, the Clovis Mafia. Not because they were corrupt, because they behaved like an institution protecting territory, not a community chasing evidence. C. Vance Haynes Jr., the geoarchaeologist most associated with defending Clovis-first, was rigorous, and rigor is supposed to be good science. But rigor calcified into gatekeeping. Every pre-Clovis claim through the 70s and 80s got run through the same wall of scrutiny, and most didn't survive it, sometimes for good reason, sometimes because the burden of proof kept moving. Then, in 1997, something happened the field couldn't wave away. Archaeologist Tom Dillahay had spent years excavating a waterlogged site in southern Chile called Monte Verde, wet enough to preserve wooden stakes still driven into the ground, fragments of animal hide, even plant remains from species that grew nowhere near the site itself, suggesting people who understood their landscape well enough to gather from far outside it. A panel of Paleo-Indian specialists, Haynes among them, traveled down to examine the material firsthand and came back having endorsed an occupation dated to roughly 14,500 years ago, a full 1,000 years before Clovis was supposed to exist anywhere. David Meltzer, one of the specialists on that panel, later called it the turning point. Clovis-first didn't collapse overnight, but the wall had a crack in it that could no longer be patched. This was the climate Cactus Hill's excavators were working in. The dig split into two teams, working different sections of the same small hill. Joseph and Lynn McAvoy's Nottoway River Survey in one area, Michael Johnson of the Archaeological Society of Virginia in another, both funded in part by the National Geographic Society and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Excavation ran on and off for nearly a decade, gloved hands screening sand a bucket at a time, eventually recovering roughly 500,000 artifacts and fragments of bone. Commercial mining had already destroyed part of the eastern edge of the site before anyone understood what was there. When the landowner, a paper company, was told what they were sitting on, they halted mining in 1993. By then, an unknown amount of material was already gone, hauled away as fill before it was ever screened, and looting kept taking more once word got out that the site produced rare, early material. Later assessments suggest more than 90% of the site's Paleo-Indian component may have been stripped by collectors before professional archaeologists could fully document it. There's another wrinkle worth sitting with. The full detailed accounting of the excavation, the exhaustive Nottoway River Survey volume laying out the radiocarbon results, the OSL data, and the soil chemistry side by side, wasn't published until 2015, nearly 2 decades after fieldwork began and long after the site's initial claims had already circulated through conferences and news coverage. For years, Outside researchers were left evaluating a headline before they could evaluate the underlying data. And that gap is exactly the kind of delay that lets suspicion take root on both sides. Here's a detail that should unsettle you more than it usually gets credit for. In their own published reports, the excavators didn't oversell what they'd found. They stated plainly that natural forces, root action, and burrowing animals could, in theory, explain artifacts appearing at unexpected depths, and that the burden of proof rested with them, not their critics. That's not the language of people manufacturing a headline. That's the language of scientists, bracing for a fight from both directions. If the layer was real, it demanded a level of proof most archaeological claims never have to meet. If it wasn't, an entire narrative about the first Americans was about to collapse under its own excitement. So the question became whether a sandy, wind-built dune could actually preserve two separate human occupations, cleanly stacked for over 15,000 years without the layers bleeding into each other. Wind moves sand, roots tunnel through it and rot away. Burrowing crayfish drag material between depths without leaving a trace. If Cactus Hill's stratigraphy had been contaminated by any of that, the whole case dissolved into an illusion. If it hadn't, something was buried here the accepted timeline had no room for. That's where the testing had to begin, and the first results didn't settle the argument. They deepened it. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of radioactive carbon in once living material, in this case charcoal, from campfires left on the dune. The radiocarbon level returned a date around 10,920 years before present, comfortably inside the expected window. The layer beneath it, separated by that sterile band of sand, returned dates of roughly 15,070 years, and in one sample, 16,670. A gap of 4,000 to 6,000 years existed between two layers sitting less than a foot apart in the same dune. One result like that invites doubt, so the excavators brought in a second independent method, one that doesn't date charcoal at all. It dates the sand itself. Optically stimulated luminescence dating works because grains of quartz and feldspar trap energy from background radiation over time, like a battery charging in the dark. Sunlight resets that charge to zero. Bury the grain again, and the clock restarts. Researcher James Feathers, working with colleagues at the University of Washington, ran this test on 13 sediment samples through Cactus Hill's stratigraphy, each one collected and sealed in light-tight tubing so the clock inside it wouldn't accidentally reset on the way to the lab. If the site had been scrambled by roots or burrowing animals, the ages should have come back scattered and out of order. They didn't. The samples returned largely incorrect sequence, older toward the bottom, independently landing the pre-Clovis layer at roughly 18,000 years old. Two unrelated methods, measuring two different physical processes, converging on the same conclusion. Soil chemists also found phosphorus, a signature tied to human occupation and bone decay, concentrated exactly at the tool-bearing depths rather than smeared evenly through the dune, and micromorphologists slicing thin sections of undisturbed sediment found distinct, minimally churned surfaces rather than the blended texture you'd expect from serious disturbance. Layer by layer, the case for an intact pre-Clovis occupation kept getting harder to dismiss. But evidence that survives one kind of scrutiny tends to invite a bigger question. If people were here 15 to 18,000 years ago, using a completely different tool-making style, then who were they? The blades in that lower layer were struck using a specific technique, long parallel-sided flakes off a prepared core, and to some researchers, that technique looked eerily familiar. It resembled work from Ice Age Europe. Smithsonian archaeologist Dennis Stanford and University of Exeter archaeologist Bruce Bradley built an entire hypothesis around that resemblance. Bradley wasn't an outsider guessing from photographs. He'd spent years personally studying and replicating Solutrean tools from sites in France and Spain, learning the specific flaking techniques toolmakers there had used, including a difficult method called overshot flaking that removes a flake clear across the opposite face of the stone. When he looked at Cactus Hill's blades, he recognized what looked like the same hard-won technical signature. Their proposal, laid out fully in the 2012 book Across Atlantic Ice, argued that Solutrean hunter-gatherers living in Ice Age France and Spain roughly 20 to 24,000 years ago could have followed the edge of North Atlantic pack ice by small boat, hunting seals and seabirds along the frozen margin the way some Arctic peoples still do today, eventually reaching the eastern coast of North America. In their reading, Solutrean technology didn't inspire Clovis technology from a distance. It became it carried across an ocean nobody thought Ice Age humans were capable of crossing. It's a seductive idea, and it's worth admitting why. The tool comparisons weren't nonsense, the timing on the surface wasn't impossible, and it offered something almost nobody else did: a concrete origin story for exactly the blade technology sitting in that lower layer. It didn't survive contact with genetics. The remains that finally settled this point had been sitting in the ground since long before anyone knew to ask the question. In 1968, construction workers on the Anzick family property in Montana uncovered a burial dusted in red ochre, an infant surrounded by more than 100 Clovis tools, one of the finest Clovis caches ever recovered, and to this day, the only confirmed Clovis burial anywhere in North America. For decades, the child known to researchers as Anzick one sat in storage with nothing more to say. In 2014, a team led by Morten Rasmussen and Eske Willerslev sequenced his genome. Anzick 1 was directly dated to roughly 12,700 years ago, squarely within the Clovis era, and his DNA traced back to Siberia and East Asia. He was more closely related to living indigenous populations across the Americas than to any European population, ancient or modern. There was no genetic trace of a Solutrean crossing, none. The paper's authors stated plainly that the data were incompatible with a European origin for Clovis populations. Stanford and Bradley pushed back, along with geneticist Stephen Oppenheimer, pointing to a rare mitochondrial lineage called haplogroup X2A as possible lingering evidence of a European connection, but most geneticists and archaeologists weren't persuaded. The Solutrean hypothesis, for the majority of the field, was dead on arrival the moment Anzick 1's genome came back. Notice what that actually proves and what it doesn't. It proves the wildest explanation for Cactus Hill's blades doesn't hold up against direct genetic evidence, a real result from real DNA in a real peer-reviewed journal, and it deserves to be taken seriously, rather than treated as one theory in a pile of equally plausible ones. What it doesn't do is explain away the dune. The blades are still there, the radiocarbon dates are still there, the luminescence ages are still there. Killing the Solutrean explanation didn't kill the underlying anomaly, it just stripped away the most cinematic answer and left the harder question standing in its place. If not a transatlantic crossing, then what does explain a blade-based toolkit, made from local stone, sealed beneath sterile sand, dated by two independent methods to thousands of years before Clovis? Nobody currently has a clean answer, and that gap, the space between disproving one theory and actually solving the mystery, forces a harder question. What does solved even mean in archaeology, and who gets to decide it? Ask who benefits if Cactus Hill's lower layer is eventually confirmed beyond argument. Every excavator who staked a career on it, certainly, and the broader case against Clovis-first. Now ask who has something to lose. Careers were built defending the old model. Textbooks would need rewriting. An entire framework for what counts as legitimate evidence would have to bend around a sandpit that amateur collectors found first. Neither side is acting in bad faith, but neither side is neutral either. Walk into most discussions of the peopling of the Americas today, and Cactus Hill gets mentioned carefully, with qualifiers attached: plausible, suggestive, not fully accepted. It sits in a strange middle zone, respected enough that serious researchers cite it, contested enough that no textbook treats it as settled fact. Stuart Fiedel, one of the more prominent skeptics of Eastern pre-Clovis claims, has argued that sandy sites like this remain vulnerable to bioturbation, the slow churn caused by roots, burrowing crayfish, and tree fall, which can shift artifacts downward over thousands of years and create the illusion of older occupation where none exists. It's not an accusation of fraud. It's a fair methodological challenge because sand is genuinely one of the hardest mediums to trust. And nobody has gone back to independently re-excavate Cactus Hill and put its stratigraphy through a fresh adversarial test. The evidence is strong, built from 2 independent dating methods and multiple lines of soil science, but it still comes from the original excavation teams, working the same hill, defending the same conclusion for over 2 decades. That's not a scandal, it's an open case that time, funding, looting, and a lack of access have kept from ever being closed, because access is its own problem. Cactus Hill sits on private land owned by a timber company. No visitor trail, no interpretive center, nothing but a 2001 listing on the Virginia Landmarks Register, granted after a formal nomination, reviewed the site's significance, and put its story on paper for the historical record. That listing comes with prestige. It doesn't come with a fence, a guard, or a budget. The site that might rewrite the opening chapter of American history is protected by nothing more than a legal designation and a private landowner's goodwill. If the land is ever sold or logged more aggressively, there's no guarantee anyone will be watching. An erosion is not a hypothetical threat in Virginia. At Jamestown, rising water and increasingly severe storm surge have pushed archaeologists into what amounts to salvage mode, digging faster than they'd like, racing to document 400-year-old material before a single storm tide erases it for good. Virginia's Department of Historic Resources runs a Threatened Sites grant program because of exactly this pressure, a modest annual fund that has still supported emergency work at more than 130 endangered locations since the 1980s. A 2017 survey of coastal counties examined over 300 archaeological sites and found more than half of them actively threatened by erosion, with 28 predicted to disappear within 50 years, gone before most people reading the sentence are gone themselves. Cactus Hill isn't on that specific list. Its threats have historically been mining and looting, not tides. But the pattern is the same pattern, playing out across the state. Irreplaceable evidence exposed, with a shrinking window and a funding system nowhere near large enough to reach it all in time. Cactus Hill isn't the only site asking the field to move its own goalposts. In New Mexico, researchers dated fossilized human footprints pressed into ancient lakebed mud at White Sands to somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, a claim so far outside the old timeline, it was met with the same reflexive doubt Cactus Hill had faced. Independent teams tested it again with different material and different methods, and the footprints held up. Actual footprints, actual human weight pressed into actual mud, dated and redated by separate labs, are about that as close to undeniable as archaeology gets. The peopling of the Americas has been getting pushed steadily backward for 30 straight years, one stubborn site at a time, against resistance nearly every step of the way. And if you think this kind of debate only happens in obscure regional sites, consider what's happening right now to the one that supposedly already settled the argument for good. Monte Verde, the Chilean site a panel of skeptical experts personally endorsed in 1997, is being challenged again. New fieldwork reported in 2026 has reignited debate over the site's age, with one research team arguing its deepest layer may not be as old as originally claimed. Tom Dillahay, the original excavator, has pushed back hard, citing what he calls serious methodological errors in the reassessment. The argument is ongoing, unresolved, playing out in peer-reviewed journals decades after most people assumed it was closed. If Monte Verde isn't safe from revision, nothing in this field is. Every date, every layer, every confident textbook sentence about the first Americans is provisional, waiting for the next lab, the next skeptical researcher willing to dig the argument back open. That instability is the real story hiding inside Cactus Hill's sand. Not a single confirmed discovery that flips the textbook overnight, but a fault line running underneath the entire field. One, a sand mine in rural Virginia, happened to expose almost by accident. The official version of how humans arrived in the Americas wasn't a lie, but it was never as finished as it sounded. It was an agreement, held in place partly by evidence and partly by the authority of the people defending it. And every pre-Clovis site that survives scrutiny chips a little more of that authority away. Nobody currently knows exactly who left those blades in that lower layer, or where they came from, or how they relate to the people who eventually became Clovis toolmakers. The DNA evidence rules out one dramatic answer. It doesn't supply a replacement. That absence, a real population with no name and no skeleton recovered to test, is not a comfortable place for a scientific field to sit. But it's where the evidence has actually left the story. Go back to that dune above the Nottoway River. Picture it the way it exists right now, this week, not in some excavation photo from the 1990s. Wind moving across the surface, pine trees at the edge of a timber company's property line. No fence to keep people out, no guarantee to keep the sand in. The old sand mining pit has grown back over with scrub and cactus. Quiet now, giving no sign it ever cracked open, one of the most contested questions in American archaeology. Somewhere beneath that surface, undisturbed since before the last ice age fully released its grip on North America, there may still be material nobody has touched, holding a date that could sharpen or complicate everything already found. Or the wind, doing exactly what it's always done to this dune, could carry it away first, one grain at a time, before anyone gets the chance to ask it a single question. Two independent dating methods already agree that something impossible by the old rules happened here. A wilder explanation for it got tested against real DNA and lost. And still no government agency, no university, no funded team has gone back to open this hill again and settle it beyond argument. That's the part of the story that never resolves. Just an ordinary looking hill of sand in rural Virginia, quietly holding evidence that the official opening chapter of American history may have been written a few thousand years too late, unmonitored, unresolved, and eroding a little more every year that nobody comes back to look.